SonicLAB TV.
Hello everybody, welcome to another SonicLAB. Today I came to work and there was a briefcase size box of fun here. Yep, that's right folks, it's the Arturia MiniBrute finally here. We're going to take a look at it and see what it can do. So what is the Arturia MiniBrute? Well, first of all, it is an analog synthesizer. Yes, that's right, analog. Not something you'd expect from somebody who makes virtual instruments and also the Origin DSP-based synthesizer. It features a single voltage controlled oscillator with a sub-oscillator and multiple waves. It's got a voltage controlled filter, which is also multi-mode. It's quite an interesting filter, more on that later. It's got two envelopes, one for amplitude and one for the filter. And it's also got an arpeggiator and control voltage in and out, which makes it quite interesting. Let's take a look at the front panel. So here it is. It's actually pretty small, but it's surprisingly heavy. It's a solid metal case, and it's got a 2-octave keyboard that features aftertouch of all things. It's laid out quite logically. You can see we've got I think it must be surface mount knobs. You've been asking what they're like. They're a little bit wobbly, and the faders similarly so, but I mean, this isn't an expensive instrument, so you can't expect it to be built like a Rolls Royce. And these little switches as well. We've got the pitch and modulation wheels mounted on the top here, and then octave switch at this point also. The rest of it is fairly logically laid out. We've got an oscillator with all the different mixer sections, so we can bring up the sub-oscillator, which can be square or sine, -1 or -2 octaves. I'm using the arpeggiator section here just to trigger it because it's only a small keyboard. Then we've got a sawtooth, square with variable pulse width, a triangle wave, external noise, and an audio input as well, which we can bring in for processing external audio. We've got a filter ADSR envelope and an amplification envelope. These have fast and slow switch settings, so you can get quite macro or have extremely long releases and attacks, that kind of thing. Then we've got the filter. So if I just bring up a sawtooth and maybe a bit of sub, you can hear there's plenty of bottom end there, and it's an interesting sounding filter. If you bring some resonance in, it really starts to drive. And it's got some really kind of quite pleasant harmonics. And that's just in the low pass. If we go into the high pass mode, get some. Really starts to break up. Lovely. You can hear it's got a really interesting characteristic, and this filter is actually modelled, or is as close a clone to the steiner-parker filter, which features a resistor network. It's something that's been put together by one of the co-designers, Yves Usson, I hope I've pronounced his name right, who is he's a cellular biologist with a PhD who lives in the same town as Arturia, which is Grenoble in France, and he's basically put a lot of effort into the analog side of it. He's a bit of an authority when it comes to DIY stuff, and he's been building things for a very long time, and his input has really shaped the way the MiniBrute sounds. So it does have actually roots in kind of synth DIY and modular. Round the back of the unit, we've got the power switch, power input, 12-volt DC, USB connection, MIDI in and out. Then we've got gate source, we can use the keyboard, the hold, which basically switches off the keyboard and just allows you to route it through, and an audio trigger mode. Then we've got 1/4" jack audio input, master out on 1/4" jack, headphone out on 1/4", and then we've got the CV and gate in. We've got the VCO pitch on control voltage, which is 1 volt per octave. Then we've got the filter frequency control, amplitude control, and a gate in for triggering the envelope. We've also got a gate out from the keyboard and pitch CV out, and that's it. There were a few questions that came in when I said that I'd got the MiniBrute for review, and one of them was, can you play the filter? Well, I've got a little arpeggiator pattern here which is playing just the filter. All the waveforms are down, it's just on the resonance. And I have tried to adjust the keyboard tracking so it could play in an octave, but it doesn't seem to quite manage it. But you can still get some very interesting tones, and if you bring the other waves in, some nice sounds. So just to go back to the oscillators, each of the waves has quite an interesting twist to them. Let's just take a look. So back to the sawtooth. Now we've got this knob here on the sawtooth section called ultra saw. And what this does is clones the waves. So you get 3 detuned and modulated internally. And then you can modulate one of them with its own rate. So you get kind of a super saw just on a single oscillator, which is kind of interesting. So, and we go to the pulse width, the square wave, we can set the pulse width, we can modulate the pulse width via the envelope or via the LFO. LFO goes nice and high into the audio range, not all the way up, but nicely done. There's also a number of different waves here. We've got sine, triangle, sawtooth, square, sample and hold, and just random. Next up is the triangle wave, and this has something called metallizer, which just kind of distorts the waveform and adds kind of weird harmonics and just misshapes it in an interesting way. And you can modulate this via the envelope or via the LFO. So just from those basic waves, you've got a whole bunch of extra tonal and modulation characteristics that's sort of outside of the scope of what you'd expect from such a simple subtractive monophonic synthesizer. There are a couple of other unusual functions on the MiniBrute which I think we should look at as well. Starting with simple triangle wave, I'm going to bring the metallizer in, which is being modulated also by this envelope here. So I like that, bring that down. And then bring the triangle wave up, modulate that ultra saw rate at a different rate. Blend them together, bring the sub oscillator up, bring the filter down a bit, and modulate that with this LFO. Starting to like the sound of that, but then I've got another modulation source here, which is vibrato. It's a dedicated section with its own rate, so I can set that to up vibrato, sine vibrato, and down vibrato. Bringing that in with the mod wheel. I've got a heck of a lot of different modulation rates and sources going on there just on a simple patch. But there's more. If I want to get a bit more grit and dirt out of it, there's this thing called brute factor. Think of this like you would if you were to take the headphone output of a Mini Moog and plug it back into the audio input. Various synthesizers have this, Dave Smith Instruments has a feedback loop built in, but what this does is along the same lines. So if I just bring up this little arpeggio pattern, mix of waves, a little bit of noise, and bring in the brute factor, and here it really starts to distort. It gets pretty unusable at this point, but if I just then take it back to a wave, go to high pass filter, add a bit of resonance, it really brings out those harmonics. Now, I said earlier that the keyboard had aftertouch, and indeed it does, and you can use that also as a modulation source. So these are the switches that control the aftertouch destination. I can also have that go to vibrato, but I'm going to have it go to cutoff. And that means that when I press, the key, I'm modulating yet another parameter. Unfortunately, there's no way of controlling the depth of the aftertouch, but I mean, it's pretty unusual to have that kind of level of control on this size keyboard as well. And it's a nice extra feature because it gives you the opportunity to perform a little more, you know, in the true analog sense. Oh, so look at that, just one mention of the word analog, and out comes the modular. This is the Monorocket case with modules by Dodo, Pittsburgh Modular and Livewire. We've also got a couple of Expert Sleeper interface modules in here. So what have I got going on? I've got the CV output of the MiniBrute patched into my Pittsburgh Modular oscillator, and then that's coming out of the sawtooth back into a mixer, which is then returning into the analog channel, the external audio in here. Then I've also got the gate output coming out of the gate output of the MiniBrute into the gate trigger of my A115 mini synthesizer voice, which is triggering the ADSR. So now if I just turn up, I've got this octave patch, that's a sawtooth. Pretty good actually. Let's try triangle, it's got a bit more guts. That's the internal, that's the external. That's not bad actually, because the oscillator in the Pittsburgh is something that I thought sounded pretty good. Let's keep going. So now let's bring up a few more sounds. Maybe I'm going to tune that to a fifth. Bring the filter into play. Now what I'm going to do is if I switch my oscillator, the low mode, and bring up the level. Now that's being modulated because that's coming out and going into the frequency modulation in of the MiniBrute. So now I can do some funky stuff with that. Or alternatively, I can bring up my ADSR trigger. And affect that. So I can patch up a whole bunch of sort of modular interactions here, as long as it's got the 1 volt per octave standard. It seems to work. It won't work with my trusty MS-20, but you know, most Eurorack stuff, System 100, that kind of thing, it's going to work pretty nicely. And that's brilliant because basically I can take this, I can plug my modular in, and I don't need any other stuff. I can just integrate it into the system, and I just really like that. I think that's a bit of genius actually. Obviously add to the fact that you've got the MIDI interface on the Arturia as well, and you start to get some other interesting possibilities as well. Incidentally, when you're processing external audio into the MiniBrute, it's possible to switch the keyboard in a number of different ways. So if I switch that into hold mode and turn up, I don't need to trigger the keyboard to actually get the filter to process the external audio, which is useful because obviously some synths you need to trigger the envelope. Or I can switch it into audio trigger mode, which what that does is it takes the external input will be the trigger for the envelope in the synth. So there's a number of ways that you can integrate it into an analog system or process external audio. Obviously there are other synthesizers that will do that. The Moog Minotaur has CV I/O as well, but the thing about this is it actually is all integrated, which is something that is quite unique and makes it kind of work very nicely with certainly my modular gear. But there are a couple of other issues as well. I mean, firstly, for some of you, not having an octave range switch on the oscillator might be a problem. You can control it via external CV and via MIDI, of course, but if it bugs you, then it bugs you. The other thing is, because it is 100% analog, it takes like 10 minutes to warm up. You need stable temperature to make sure that the oscillators are fine. And while that might be a problem for some, it's actually a plus in a lot of ways. It sort of proves the analog nature of the instrument. In fact, because this unit was a pre-production model, I did have some issues with tracking against external CV equipment. But got my trusty micro screwdriver out and I was able to adjust via 2 adjustment ports on the back of the unit to get it all tied up again and calibrated nicely. But I think ultimately what we have here is a well thought out, characterful analog monosynth. And I mean that in a good way. You know, it's got an unusual filter, it's got lots of features and little touches that make it kind of unique. And I think that's quite important. I mean, analog generally is unique anyway, but with a basic simple subtractive synthesizer, it's easy just to make something that relies purely on the sound of the filter and the oscillators, whereas this has got a bit more besides. And add to that the integration into analog gear, I think we've got something that will work both for perhaps the person who just wants to get into some analog and wants to make a start, this would be a good point, or someone who's already got some analog and maybe wants to interface this with an existing system. So all in all, I think Arturia have done a pretty good job here, and it's something that I would recommend if it's the sort of thing you're looking for.